Good afternoon, boys and girls. Okay, we're at chapter 16. We're at the end of the scarecrow party in the field. We have to find out what happens to Gummidge and his new wife and Hannah. Ooh, so much to see. And will John and Susan make it home without being in trouble? Ooh, lots to think about. Here we go, chapter 16. All the other scarecrows crowded around to look at poor Hannah, who was indeed a sad sight. Even her face had dwindled, and her body was as flat as an unstuffed pincushion. Occasionally she gave a little gusty sigh. You great gapping, guffed sophs, in an excited voice. The children looked around and saw that Earthy was standing just behind them. Why don't you do something? She inquired. Oyez, my dear, said Gummidge hurriedly. And picking up Hannah by the head, he dangled her about until a perfect torrent of sawdust rained from her body. She'll trickle to death if you do that, screamed Earthy, who seized Hannah and laid her on the ground again. Then she began to stuff handfuls of sawdust into the sick scarecrow's side. All the time she stuffed, she made consoling noises. There, there, my dearie, she said. You'll soon be all right again. It all spilled out again as soon as she was on her feet, remarked Gummidge gloomily. Earthy stood up and pulled at a safety pin that was stuck into the tallest scarecrow's shirt. Then she knelt down again and pinned up the hole. Hannah opened her mouth once or twice, but no words came out until Earthy had shaken her into shape and run some of the sawdust from one leg into the other. I've always been troubled with the mice, said Hannah. I feel all upset, I do. We'll get somebody to carry you home, said Earthy. Boggy, you live in the field next door, don't you? You can help her home. That I won't do, said Boggy. He was particularly stiff-looking scarecrow, and he spoke in a husky voice. I don't want to take her, not if she's got the mice. I might catch them. He moved away and began to hurry across the field. A great many of the other scarecrows followed his example. The children heard them muttering, We don't want the mice. They'll give us the mice if we stay here. She ought to be kept separate. I knew a boggle who died of the mice. Soon only 2 scarecrows were left besides Earthy, Wurzel, and Hannah. They were 2 elderly lady scarecrows. Susan heard one of them say, Didn't you ever hear tell of my Aunt Scary? She had mice in her head. It wasn't to be wondered at, for they had to restuff her, some with old straw and some with new. You don't say, exclaimed the other. I reckon we best be moving. They hobbled away and still continued to talk of the dreaded mice. Susan heard snatches of their conversation as they went. They don't do the only cure is to swallow. They say the only cure is to swallow a mousetrap. I'd sooner be restuffed. What a lot they are, exclaimed Earthy indignantly. And now, what are we to do with Hannah? We might put her in Gummidge's nest, suggested Susan. The very thing, cried Earthy, though Gummidge looked a little sulky and said that he hoped Hannah wouldn't meddle with the eggs. Of course she won't, said Earthy. So John and Susan helped the 2 scarecrows carry Hannah into the spinney. They had some difficulty in hauling her into the tree. Gummidge insisted on going first. Though he was a shockingly bad climber, the children heard him scuffing about in the nest. The cardboard eggs addled, he said, throwing a handful of sticky pulp down to the ground, and the other eggs are cold. What a pity, cried Susan. Well, I don't know about that, he said. Earthy and me don't want to be bothered with sitting. We're going to see a bit of life. I've had a hatch of robins and a new wife, and that's enough for the season. He hurled the eggs out of the nest. I feel that reckless, he muttered. I feel that reckless. I don't care what I do. Susan did not feel reckless. She felt very sad. She was dreadfully afraid that Wurzel Gummidge would leave Scatterbrook and never return. She helped Earthy to settle Hannah in the nest, while Gummidge continued to drop boxes and paper bags over the side of it. Now you'll all be all right, my dear, won't you? Asked Earthy. Ask her and Gummidge to come back, whispered Susan to Hannah. The sick scarecrow held out a dusty arm. You'll come back in the morning, won't you? She asked. Oyez, promised Gummidge, and he slid down the tree stiffly. When the children reached the ground again, they saw that Gummidge and Earthy were holding hands. I think we better go to bed, said John. Earthy and me are going for a nice long walk, said Gummidge. The children noticed that he was wearing his coat again, and that Mr. Robin was nestled contentedly under one ear. It's been a lovely day, went on Gummidge contentedly, and the battle was a treat, and I've got a beautiful wife. I suppose we better go home now, said Susan. Don't let's, objected John, but his sister saw that Gummidge did not look as though he wanted to be bothered with any more talk. Indeed, he told them so. Oyez, you best be getting along. I shan't have time to look after you now that I've got a wife of my own. Look after us, indeed, said John. Susan pulled him away. She was feeling rather sad and lonely, and was afraid that Gummidge and his new wife might not stay in Scatterbrook. Not that it matters, she thought. He says he doesn't want us now. Perhaps the droop of her head told Gummidge that he had not been very kind, for presently he called out, You can come and give us a lift with Hannah in the morning. Good night. Good night, said Susan. Good night, said John. Good night, called Earthy in her shrill little voice. Then John and Susan hurried through the field and along the winding lane that led to the farm. We better take off our boots, whispered John as they waited in the porch. Before they could even begin to unfasten the bootlaces, the door was opened from inside. Where have you been? Asked Mrs. Brainwaite in an angry voice. Mrs. Brainwaite looked very large and fierce. She appeared to be wearing a row of white rosettes on her forehead, but when the children looked again, they saw that these were only tightly twisted curling papers. Emily Goodenough stood by the kitchen door. The candle she held in her hand threw flickering shadows onto the wall. Where have you been? Repeated Mrs. Brainwaite. We've been out, said John. Of all the naughty tricks, Mrs. Brainwaite paused as though she was trying to remember enough cross words to scold them with. We haven't been a bit naughty, protested Susan. But as she spoke, Mrs. Brainwaite's furious face made her feel naughtier and naughtier and naughtier. Some people always made her feel naughty, however good she might have been. Emily said we might go, muttered John. Didn't you, Emily? I never did. Oh, yes, said Susan. You said go where you like and when you like, only don't bother me. Emily opened her mouth and then shut it again as she remembered that she had said something of the sort earlier in the afternoon. And what have you been doing? Rapped out, Mrs. Brainwaite, and her curled papers bobbed fiercely. We've been playing with the scarecrows, whispered Susan, though she didn't expect to be believed. You'd best tell us the truth now, warned Mrs. Braithwaite. Well then, I will, said John defiantly. We were asked to go to a scarecrow's birthday party, and we went. One of the scarecrows is a very great friend of ours, and he's going to be married. John felt there was no need to keep Gummidge a secret any longer. Mrs. Brainwaite made a most irritating clicking noise with her tongue, and then, turning to Emily, she said, I've never come across such badly behaved and brought up children in all my born days. Now, it so happened that Emily had not been getting on very well with her sister that evening, and it happened, too, that she could not bear other people to find fault with children. After all, Emily had been their nurse, and she had helped to bring them up. You said you might go, said Susan, pleading. You said we might go, said Susan pleadingly. I dare say I did, said Emily, but I didn't understand what you wanted to do. Now come along to bed, my dearies. Mrs. Brainwaite clicked her tongue once more. Have you or anyone else heard of scarecrows giving birthday parties? She demanded. Answer me that, Emily. I should have thought you'd be ashamed to listen to children telling a pack of lies. They're always been fanciful, said Emily. Susan longed to be hugged, but Mrs. Brainwaite stood between them. Fanciful? snorted the farmer's wife. If I'd anything to do with them, I'd make them give a straightforward explanation of their goings-on. You're not gonna got anything to do with them, snapped Emily. And a cold will be the explanation if you don't get off to bed as quickly as a knife. The children were thankful enough for Emily's roughness as she whisked them out of their clothes and hustled them into their bed. Her hands felt chillier and bonier than ever, but she did not ask questions and talked comfortingly about hot water bottles. It's all my fault, declared Emily at last. I ought to have taken better notice of what you were saying. Now, you'd best go to sleep as soon as May, or you won't be able to enjoy your last day in Scatterbrook. Last day, repeated Susan. Had you forgotten that? Asked Emily. Today's Tuesday, you know. It is morning already because the clock struck 12, and you go home on Wednesday. Oh, dear, sighed Susan. Somehow the children had lost count of the days in Scatterbrook. It seemed such a long time now since the end of the whooping cough and the beginning of gummidge. All the same, thought Susan, as she scrambled into bed. All the same. Perhaps it's a good thing we are going. I don't know what we should do if gummidge went first. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. Looking forward to find out, will they see gummidge again? See you soon.